Thank you so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi, and today we're going to speak about, obviously, a big topic here that is big both nationally and globally. The Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, controversially, as you may know, visited the island of Taiwan just last week. Now, that led to several days of high-profile military exercises by the Chinese, and those were ones that the U.S. and many of its allies condemned. Now, Taiwan is a U.S. supported democratic island that is claimed by China in a long and very, very complicated history. But what is clear, though, is that tensions are running high between the U.S. and China, and probably safe to say increasing in no small part due to Taiwan and its status. So for a bit more on this today and kind of clear up some of those questions about Taiwan and U.S. and Chinese relations specifically, we are now joined by Colorado State University Assistant Professor Peter Harris, whose area of expertise focuses on U.S. and China relations. Peter, we're really looking forward to having you on and clearing up some of these questions here on 9 News Plus. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we get to kind of more in-depth questions about this, Peter, do you mind starting off with a bit of an overview about Taiwan and why it is such a flashpoint between the U.S. and China?
Sure. I mean, it's a long and it's a complicated history, but one way to think about the Taiwan issue today is as a continuation of the Chinese Civil War that ended in 1949 with the two sides in control of different parts of China. So the Chinese Communist Party effectively won the Chinese Civil War, and in 1949 was left in control of basically all of mainland China. The other side in the Chinese Civil War, the nationalists, retreated to the island of Taiwan, which was the only part of China that they controlled at the end of the Chinese Civil War. So since 1949, both the communists and the government on Taiwan have claimed to be the legitimate government of the whole of China, have come to the realization that unification is not really desirable and not practical, and that Taiwan really is should be regarded as a sovereign state. That's really the view of President Tsai, who's in power right now. But for the Chinese Communist Party, which governs, as I said, mainland China based in Beijing, it's completely unacceptable. Taiwan to them must be returned to China, and they really regard it as very important that the world and the government on Taiwan as well adhere to this one China principle, the idea that there is one China, that China and Taiwan belong to the same state. And in their minds, the Chinese Communist Party is the legitimate government of that single state.
Wonderful context, Peter, and thank you so much for that. Now, with that in mind, why did Nancy Pelosi visit Taiwan last week, and what do you think it means for U.S. and Chinese relations?
So up until 1979, the United States recognized the government on Taiwan as the government of the whole of China. Since 1979, the United States has recognized the Communist Party as the government of the whole of China. That was always a very divisive issue, even in the 70s and 80s, especially in Congress, and it remains a divisive issue today. People like Pelosi have a long history of supporting Taiwan. Taiwan is a democracy, upholds human rights, very friendly to the United States. The government in Beijing, by contrast, is an autocracy, is a communist regime, certainly does not uphold human rights. So it's always been an issue since the 70s and 80s that some politicians inside the United States really want to defend US relations with Taiwan. Under the One China policy, where the United States government is not allowed to maintain official relations with Taiwan, but it does maintain pretty close unofficial relations. What Pelosi, I think, was doing is trying to put a spotlight on that and insist that Taiwan has got friends in the US government, including at the very highest levels.
So with that said, what do you think this move does? Pelosi going there, obviously a prominent, high profile U.S. politician going to Taiwan and visiting. How does that affect things one way or the other?
Well, the first thing it does is it really annoys the Chinese Communist Party, the government in Beijing, and that's an understatement. For Beijing, it's completely unacceptable for the United States to send such a high-profile leader to Taiwan because it would seem to confer legitimacy on a government that they regard as illegitimate. Right? To them, Taiwan is a renegade province, and it's not acceptable for the Speaker of the House of Representatives to visit. So that's why you saw these live fire drills around the island of Taiwan. Beijing is trying to posture and show that we have the military power to seize Taiwan by force if we choose to do that in the future. And this was a very unwise provocation by the United States. I think it also causes problems for the Biden administration, which would have preferred to not have this crisis. Some people are calling it the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis unfold. I mean, as a result, China has suspended cooperation on things like climate change, which is a real setback for the Biden administration. But it was welcomed in Taiwan. You know, for people in Taiwan, it's very important for them to hear that there's a faction inside the US government, including such a powerful woman as the Speaker of the House, who supports close relations with Taiwan. So I think the visit was really celebrated in Taiwan, but not so much celebrated in the White House and really deplored by leaders in Beijing.
So interesting context there. So with that in mind, how likely is it that China attacks Taiwan, and did Pelosi's visit make that more or less likely?
I think it's unlikely that China will attack Taiwan soon or imminently, but the long-term possibility is real. We shouldn't underestimate in the United States how serious an issue this is for people in China. It's a core issue of national security and national identity and sovereignty for people in China. And if the prospect ever arose that Taiwan would slip away from Beijing, that the chances of a peaceful unification kind of evaporated, at that point, I think decision makers in Beijing could conclude that a military invasion is the only way to incorporate Taiwan into the People's Republic. And then you might see an invasion happen. So what Pelosi's visit does, the risk that it might do is convince leaders in Beijing that, in fact, the United States and Taiwan are conspiring to make peaceful unification impossible. If people in Beijing believe that Taiwan is moving under the US security umbrella, that the United States is ready to defend Taiwan in a war, all those kind of things, then that it really gets pretty risky, and the chances of invasion go up. And I think that's why you see the Biden administration and officials in the military in particular very nervous about the visit, because to them it sends really the wrong signal to Beijing. What the Biden administration probably wants to do is uphold stability and the status quo. And what the Pelosi visit did was suggest to Beijing that, you know what, a lot of people in the United States do not want to uphold the status quo, and that's not acceptable to Beijing.
You covered the US and the Chinese reactions to the visit. How has it been received in other democratic first world nations, so for example, Europe?
Taiwan has a lot of friends in the democratic world, in Europe, and also in East Asia and the wider Asia Pacific. So for a lot of politicians in democratic states, I think the visit was celebrated. People do like to show solidarity with a democracy like Taiwan. But then when you move behind the frontline politicians and you move into military circles and strategists, military strategists, there is nervousness. China is a nuclear power. If a war erupted over Taiwan, there can be no guarantees that that war would not turn nuclear, which would be devastating, not least of all for the people of Taiwan. When push comes to shove, it's really unclear, desperately unclear, that democratic states like the US, those in Europe, Japan, would really go to war to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion because of this risk of nuclear escalation in particular. So while a lot of kind of leading politicians might be gleeful at the sight of the Speaker of the House in Taiwan, behind the scenes, I think there's nervousness that a visit like this can cause an unnecessary provocation, could make the chances of war go up to a non-trivial degree. And that's a bad thing when lives are on the line, when we're talking about the possibility of a war, potentially a nuclear war. A lot of people who get paid to uphold national security and international security get nervous at times like this, and for good reason.
Certainly understand some of those reasons behind that. And you mentioned the ambiguity and the lack of clarity about whether or not the U.S. would defend Taiwan in a war. Hasn't Joe Biden made a few comments or slips, perhaps indicating that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in a war against China?
He has. On several occasions, he's said unscripted remarks that he would order the defense of Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. But I think what this latest crisis revealed is that might have been cheap talk. That might have been Biden saying something that sounds good, but when push comes to shove, that doesn't actually reflect the views of the US government. So Biden and the rest of his team, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, were at pains over the past week to convey to Beijing that US policy has not changed. There's no commitment to defend Taiwan. The United States believes in the one China principle.
One final question here. Yeah. Just if you had any final thoughts about the situation and if there's any possible rectification between these two sides that seem to be only increasing the tensions between the two of them.
Sure. Well, I think it's very important that the United States and China reach a working agreement over Taiwan and other issues. These are the two most powerful states in the world. They're both nuclear armed states and the largest economies in the world. The whole world has got a stake in the United States and China having positive, stable relations. And I think the Biden administration understand that, and it should be a priority for the United States. The Taiwanese foreign minister, Joseph Wu, said something interesting last week, which was he did not draw from this crisis the lesson that Taiwan needed a defensive commitment from the United States or anybody else. He drew the lesson that Taiwan could defend itself and needed to become more able to defend itself in the event of a Chinese attack. They want arms, just like Ukraine wants arms. They want some forms of support, just like Ukraine gets economic support and other forms of support. But it seems that some figures in the Taiwanese government are coming to the realization that foreign intervention to defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion might not materialize, and that Taiwan needs to have an independent, autonomous ability to deter a Chinese attack. I think that was an interesting set of remarks from the Taiwanese foreign minister. And my preference would be for the United States, its allies and partners, and Taiwan to work together to strengthen Taiwan's own independent, autonomous ability to defend itself, rather than rely on this very uncertain, very ambiguous US kind of latent threat of an intervention, which might never materialize.
Fascinating insight, Peter. Thank you so much for a few minutes of your time and lending us your expertise on this complicated issue here on 9 News Plus. Once again, Peter Harris, an assistant professor of political science at Colorado State University, who specializes on U.S. and China relations. Once again, thanks for your time here today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.